Statistically speaking, the Wild West wasn't quite as wild as dime novels in Hollywood would have us believe, but it wasn't exactly tame either. Sure, we all picture gunslingers squaring off at high noon, saloon brawls spilling into the dusty street, and rattlesnakes coiled in the sagebrush, but survival out on the frontier was about much more than quick draws and six. For Native American communities, especially their women, life meant carrying centuries of tradition forward, even as railroads, soldiers, and settlers reshaped their world. And while we like to imagine we'd be tough enough to make it in that world, the truth is most of us probably wouldn't have lasted long. Yes, you would have died in the Wild West. But before we jump into these remarkable photographs and the stories they tell, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button to join us here at the Sleepy Historian tonight, where we bring the past back to life one tale at a time. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, and more importantly, which parts of Wild West history you'd like us to explore next. These stories are built from your curiosity as much as from the dusty archives. So saddle up, partners. Tonight, we're not following the trail of cowboys or outlaws. We're stepping into the lives of Native American women who carried their cultures through one of the most turbulent centuries in American history. From the pueblos of New Mexico to the mesas of Arizona and the plains of Montana, their portraits show resilience, identity, and dignity in a world of constant upheaval. Ready? Let's ride. Quick draw. At the turn of the 20th century, the American Southwest and the Great Lakes were lands in transition. Cultures that had thrived for centuries were entering an era marked by railroads, photographers, and new economies pressing in from every direction. The camera, still a relatively novel invention, began to capture not only landscapes, but also women, whose faces, garments, and surroundings told stories of resilience and tradition in the Old West. One of the earliest of these images shows Lee Key Yates, daughter of a Laguna Pueblo chief. Around 1905, she was photographed in ceremonial attire, a Kuwait belt, bead necklaces, and garments that spoke not only of fashion but of identity and sacred meaning. The Pueblo people had long lived in the semi-arid heart of New Mexico, west of Albuquerque, where desert light cast sharp outlines on adobe walls and cornfields. By the time of the photograph, railroads had begun to pierce the region, linking Pueblo markets with wider economies, but also introducing cultural pressures. Still, Yates's portrait preserves a sense of continuity, an insistence that Pueblo ceremony remained at the center of communal life. Around 1908, photographer Roland Reed captured the likeness of an Ojibwe woman. Her community lived far from the Southwest, in the wooded lands of the Great Lakes. Here, life was patterned by the rhythm of seasons: fishing in summer, gathering in autumn, and relying on birchbark crafts and beadwork that had been practiced for generations. The photograph, however, reflects not isolation but encounter, the juxtaposition of traditional artistry with the creeping presence of modern technology, from steamboats to railways, that altered the Ojibwe's landscape. In her beadwork and stance, one reads both pride and quiet resilience. In 1900, Carl Wurst took a photograph in Arizona of two young Pueblo women seated near a window. Their rolled hairstyles indicated youth, readiness for future roles, and participation in the codes of their community. At that moment in history, villages on the mesas of the Colorado Plateau had become destinations for artists, traders, and curious travelers. The gazes of the two women are fixed outward, perhaps toward that approaching world. Their presence, though framed by adobe interiors, hinted at the delicate balance between embracing change and safeguarding identity. The same tension is visible in an 1878 image from Fort Keogh in Montana Territory, where a Cheyenne woman was photographed in the wake of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Following 1876, the U.S. Army established forts across the northern plains under General Nelson Miles. For the Cheyenne and their Algonquian-speaking Alizé, Lakota, and Arapahoes was an era of displacement, negotiation, and loss. Yet in her portrait, the woman's posture conveys strength. The photograph is not only a record of conquest, but a reminder of enduring traditions that outlived the battlefields. Together, these early images show us that the women of the Old West were not merely subjects for photographers. They were anchors of community life. Their clothing and hairstyles were more than adornments. They were coded expressions of identity, ceremony, and generational continuity. In each gaze, whether from a New Mexico pueblo, a Great Lakes village, or a Montana plain. There is both an encounter with modernity and a refusal to surrender cultural roots. These women became symbols of a West far richer, more complex, and more enduring than the myths of cowboys and outlaws. As the 19th century drew to a close, the American Southwest entered a decisive moment of transition. Railroads crept across deserts, New Mexico was moving steadily toward statehood, and anthropologists, photographers, and artists arrived with growing frequency. Yet for the communities who had lived in the region for centuries, life was still measured by the rhythms of agriculture, ceremony, and kinship. The photographs from this period, especially of women, serve as enduring records of that balance between constancy and change. One striking scene presents Carlaua Chiwi and her daughters, Maria and Felicitatura, women of the Isleta Pueblo community. The portrait, taken in the early 20th century and attributed to the photographer Poli, shows 3 generations bound together in quiet dignity. New Mexico, at this time, was transitioning from a U.S. territory to full statehood in 1912. This political shift brought new pressures laws, taxes, and land disputes, but the photograph places emphasis elsewhere. The framing highlights maternal presence, kinship ties, and the pivotal role of women within Tiwa-speaking community life. To the outside world, the image might seem domestic. To the Pueblo, it carried far deeper meaning, a reminder that continuity ran through the lines of mothers and daughters. From the mesas of Arizona comes another evocative image: young Hopi girls of Sikiotki and Sikomovi on First Mesa, photographed by Frederick Monson in the early decades of the 20th century. Their attire is ceremonial, tied to agricultural cycles and village celebrations. The Hopi calendar was structured around planting, harvesting, and rituals that ensured balance between people, crops, and the spirit world. In the photograph, the girls wear garments that affirm not only their personal identities but their belonging to the land itself. Their hairstyles, elaborate and coiled, signify stages of youth and preparation for future roles. For outsiders, these details might seem merely aesthetic. For the Hopi, they were part of a sacred language of symbols. The early 1900s were already a time of upheaval, with boarding schools and missionaries encroaching. Yet the Hopi continued to uphold these ceremonies as affirmations of survival. Another image, dated 1895, captures a young woman of Taos, Pueblo. In present-day New Mexico, she is set against the adobe walls of a centuries-old village that had been inhabited continuously by Tiwa-speaking peoples. Her garments blend daily practicality with traces of ritual adornment, reflecting the dual role women held sustaining the household while embodying cultural identity. The Taos Pueblo itself stood as a crossroads of trade, with roots stretching across the upper Rio Grande long before European arrival. Multi-story adobe houses, rising like organic fortresses of clay and timber, reflected communal architecture, designed to withstand both climate and time. In her portrait, the young woman becomes a human counterpart to that architecture, firm, enduring, and deeply rooted in place. A final glimpse from this chapter comes from 1892, showing a young Kiowa woman in an everyday moment alongside her community. Her garments include beaded decorations and textiles that reveal exchange with settlers and plains traders. By this period, the Kiowa had already endured relocation and confinement to reservations. Yet the photograph suggests more than hardship. Her focused gaze, poised between youthful roles and ceremonial responsibilities, conveys continuity in the face of change. The adornments she wears were not mere ornaments but living links to ritual practices, alliances, and ancestral memory. Taken together, these images trace a network across the Southwest, from Isleta Pueblo to Hopi mesas, from Taos adobe walls to Kiowa encampments. In each case, women stand at the center, anchoring households, sustaining rituals, and transmitting identity. Photographers may have intended to capture exotic subjects for outside audiences, but what endures today is different: a record of resilience, motherhood, youth, and tradition carried into a new century. As the 19th century approached its final decades, indigenous communities across the American West faced a world that was shifting rapidly. Railroads sliced across mountains, government boundaries reshaped territories, and new economies pressed into traditional lands. Yet, despite this turbulence, community life and ritual practices endured, often captured in photographs that today offer rare windows into those transformations. Among these, The images of Spokane women, Pueblo, corn maidens, and Taos, women of the 1880s, stand out for their ability to connect myth, ritual, and daily life. In 1897, photographer Frank LaRoche created a portrait of a woman of the Spokane Nation. Her clothing and adornments reflected the cultural life of the Columbia Plateau, where basketry, beadwork, and ritual dress carried both artistic and spiritual significance. This was a period of intense change in the Pacific Northwest. Railroads arrived, timber industries expanded, and settler towns pressed against traditional fishing and gathering grounds. Still, within the Spokane community, cultural practices held firm. The photograph reveals not just an individual but a living tradition: beadwork that signified kinship, garments that reflected subsistence patterns, and a steady gaze that embodied cultural resilience. The image reminds us that while new economies imposed themselves, indigenous women remained central figures in sustaining continuity. A few years later, around 1904, another photograph emerged from present-day New Mexico depicting a corn maiden, a mythic figure among the Pueblo peoples. Corn, or maize, was not merely food. It was the spiritual and agricultural foundation of Pueblo life. The corn maiden embodied fertility, abundance, and the guidance of the agricultural calendar. In ceremonies, she represented both sustenance and sacred offering, binding human communities to the cycles of the earth. The image of the corn maiden around 1904 underscores these ties. She appears adorned in garments that reflect both ritual, symbolism, and daily labor, reminding viewers that survival in the Southwest depended on intimate knowledge of land, soil, and season. The photograph thus stands at the intersection of myth and practice, where spirituality and subsistence were one and the same. At roughly the same time, photographer Carl Everton Moon began a project to document Native American communities across the Southwest. His work, undertaken in the early 1900s, sought to preserve rituals, landscapes, and histories at the very moment they were being challenged by expansion, missionization, and new civil structures. While some criticized his romanticized approach, his photographs provided one of the most extensive visual records of the period. Through his lens, we see women not as anonymous figures but as participants in ceremonies, daily labor, and the defense of identity in changing times. Stepping back slightly to the 1880s, we encounter another striking image: a woman of Taos Pueblo, photographed in the New Mexico Territory. She wears dark wool clothing with a shawl draped over her shoulders, turquoise necklaces glinting in the desert light, and a traditional hairstyle that signals her role and identity. Behind her rise adobe houses, unmistakable symbols of Taos Pueblo's communal architecture. These multi-story dwellings, crafted from earth and timber, had stood for centuries and embodied collective resilience. Her expression in the portrait suggests not only everyday routine, agriculture, trade, and ritual, but also the awareness of standing at a cultural threshold. The 1880s marked a time when Pueblo communities faced pressure from territorial authorities and missionary schools. Yet the woman's clothing and adornments affirmed the endurance of her people's traditions. Together, the Spokane woman, the corn maiden, and the Taos Pueblo figure create a tableau of continuity and transformation. Each photograph is a record of identity in motion: women at the center of rituals, myths, and community life. They remind us that even in moments of upheaval, cultural bonds remain strong. And as the century turned, these images became more than portraits. They became testaments to indigenous resilience, speaking across time to tell us that traditions, though tested, were never extinguished. By the late 19th century, the American West was undergoing profound reconfiguration. The Civil War had ended, railroads carved deep into the frontier, and territorial boundaries were hardening into state lines. For Native communities, this meant more than geographic change. It signaled upheavals in ceremony, language, and everyday life. Yet within this shifting world, indigenous women continued to play defining roles, sometimes recorded in photographs that reveal both personal stories and broader struggles. Among these figures are Marsha Pascal of Cherokee descent, young Kiowa women in Indian Territory, and the unforgettable Hattie Tom of the Apache. One of the best documented lives is that of Marsha Pascal, a woman of Cherokee descent who came of age in the 1880s. She was the daughter of George Pascal, an officer in the U.S. Army. Her position in a mixed household after the Civil War embodied the contradictions of the period. The Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma, was a space of transition where Cherokee communities, already scarred by removal, now faced railroads, federal laws, and waves of settlers. Marsha Pascal stood at the intersection of two worlds, one tied to her Cherokee lineage and another bound to her father's military identity. Photographs of her from this era capture a woman poised and dignified, her very presence testifying to the complexities of Native women navigating post-war America. She was neither fully sheltered from federal intrusion nor entirely separated from her ancestral heritage. Instead, she embodied resilience and individual life that reflected broader patterns of survival. Around 1894, another poignant image emerges, that of a Kiowa woman from the southern plains, then living in what was designated Indian Territory. By this point, the Plains Wars had ended, and the U.S. government had imposed strict boundaries. Communities once sustained by buffalo hunting and regional alliances now faced confinement, new laws, and diminished autonomy. The photograph presents a woman in ceremonial dress, her attire carefully adorned with beads and textiles. These were not simply decorative, but encoded with cultural significance. Ceremonies, though strained by external pressures, continued to affirm kinship and belonging. Her posture reveals both solemnity and strength, an assertion that despite the boundaries drawn around them, Kiowa life and identity endured. From the Apache world of the Southwest comes the unforgettable presence of Hattie Tom. Photographed in 1899 by Frank Reinhardt, she was Chiricahua Apache, living at the tail end of an era defined by military campaigns and forced removals. Her portrait is serene, yet layered with historical weight. Adornments and hairstyle reflect Cherokee craft and identity, while her posture conveys calm resilience. By the 1890s, many Apache had been confined, relocated, or even displayed to the public as curiosities in ethnographic exhibitions. Yet Hattie Tom's photograph is not a passive record, it is a statement of presence. Her calm gaze insists that Apache identity was not erased but reasserted. Even as new civil powers tried to redefine the landscape of the Southwest, other images from this period further underline the challenges and resilience of Apache women. Isabel Pareco in Jodi, for instance, appears in an 1886 photograph as a prisoner of war, captured during the campaigns that ended with Geronimo's surrender. Her portrait embodies the heavy toll of U.S. military advances. Unlike stage studio portraits, her image evokes the raw reality of captivity, displacement, and the end of an era of armed resistance. Yet even in this vulnerable setting, her face and posture communicate dignity. Taken together, these portraits Marsha Pascal of Cherokee descent, the young Kiowa woman in Indian Territory, Hattie Tom, and Isabel Pareco in Jodi show us that Native women were not passive witnesses to history. They were central figures in the negotiation between tradition and change, between cultural continuity and imposed boundaries. Their clothing, posture, and expressions form a visual archive of survival. To study their images is to glimpse not just individuals but entire nations grappling with loss and transformation, yet refusing to surrender their identities. The final decades of the 19th century witnessed a new chapter in how Native peoples were represented to the wider American public. No longer confined to photographs taken in villages or on reservations, some indigenous men and women found themselves placed directly on stage, both literally and figuratively. The rise of traveling shows, ethnographic exhibitions, and a public fascinated with the vanishing frontier created new, often troubling ways of presenting Native identity. For Native women, this period brought both visibility and distortion. At the same time, communities like the Hopi of Arizona and the Apache of the Southwest maintained their own cycles of ritual and kinship, creating a complex picture of resilience amid spectacle and displacement. One of the most striking figures of this era was Lizzie Longwolf, photographed in 1886 as a performer in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. These traveling spectacles combined equestrian demonstrations, choreographed battles, and exhibition shooting into dramatic performances for audiences in the United States and Europe. Native men and women were recruited to participate, often presented as symbols of a frontier that the shows claimed was disappearing. Lizzie Longwolf's presence on stage illustrates this paradox. On one hand, she embodied the skill, tradition, and equestrian expertise of her people. On the other, her performance was framed within a narrative controlled by outsiders, designed to entertain rather than to authentically represent indigenous life. Her image reminds us that Native women were sometimes drawn into national myths, shaping how millions of people remembered the West, often at the cost of accuracy and self-determination. Meanwhile, in Arizona, photographs from the mid-1890s show young Hopi women of the Pueblo communities. In an 1895 image, a Hopi girl wears garments and adornments that identify family ties and stages of life. On the mesas of Arizona, communities were in close contact with traders, merchants, and anthropologists, yet their seasonal ceremonies remained central. Hairstyles, woven textiles, and turquoise ornaments were not merely decorative, they marked stages of youth, preparation for marriage, and integration into village society. These details, carefully captured in photographs, provide a window into how identity was expressed in visible form. The contrast is striking. While some indigenous women, like Lizzie Longwolf, were placed in artificial performances for distant crowds, others were photographed within their homelands, embodying cultural practices that had endured for centuries. The Apache story of this era offers yet another perspective, one marked by displacement, captivity, and resilience. The Chiricahua Apache woman, Isabel Pareco, Njadi, appears in an 1886 photograph as a prisoner of war, captured during the campaigns that culminated in the surrender of Geronimo. Her image is haunting. She stands as a symbol of communities forcibly uprooted and confined by the U.S. military. Yet even in captivity, her presence communicates strength and humanity, refusing to be reduced to victimhood. The displacement of Apache women continued into the late 19th century. Families were relocated far from their homelands, confined to military posts, or transported eastward. Photographs from this time capture not only individuals, but also the broader reality of dislocation. These images show us that the end of armed resistance did not mean the end of Apache identity. Women sustained kinship networks, preserved songs, and carried forward traditions, even under conditions of surveillance and confinement. By the turn of the century, this contrast defined much of Native women's experiences. Some, like Lizzie Longwolf, were drawn into the orbit of mass entertainment, their identities reshaped for public spectacle. Others, like the Hopi women of First Mesa, sustained agricultural and ritual life in the face of growing outside interest. Still others, like Isabel Pareco, Njadi, and her fellow Apache women, endured the harshest consequences of military conquest. Yet across all these images, the thread of resilience is unmistakable. Native women remained central, whether on stage, in village ceremonies, or in exile. Their stories, preserved through photographs, remind us that the Old West was never a single narrative but a tapestry of lives woven from survival, tradition, and adaptation. As the century turned and the 20th century began, Native women continued to anchor their communities amid relentless change. Photographers captured their likenesses in moments both ordinary and ceremonial, providing a visual archive of survival. From the Columbia Plateau of the Pacific Northwest to the southern plains of the Comanche, and into the sacred rituals of marriage in Pueblo villages, each image tells of continuity under pressure. These closing portraits remind us that indigenous women were more than subjects of curiosity. They were keepers of heritage, language, and ritual at a time when so much else was being stripped away. Around 1900, an image shows a woman identified only as Alice, possibly connected to the Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla peoples of the Columbia Plateau. Her attire and facial features suggest affiliation with these groups, while the textiles and beadwork she wears reflect exchanges within a region undergoing profound shifts. The Pacific Northwest at this time was marked by treaties, displacements, and territorial reconfigurations. Railroads and new industries intruded upon traditional fishing and gathering grounds, and yet the photograph of Alice emphasizes continuity. Her bead necklaces, her posture, and her calm presence affirm identity and belonging, even as external forces threatened to redefine her homeland. An 1885 image offers another perspective, that of a young Comanche woman. Her hairstyle, beads, and textiles reflect craft practices as well as the commercial contacts that had become common on the southern plains. By this time, the great herds of bison, once the foundation of Comanche subsistence, had been nearly annihilated. The transition to bounded reservations altered not only mobility but also foodways, clothing, and labor roles. Yet the portrait of this young woman suggests adaptation rather than disappearance. Her garments incorporate materials obtained through trade, but their arrangement follows patterns of tradition. Her steady gaze communicates both youthful curiosity and cultural assurance. It is a reminder that Comanche women sustained networks of kinship and economy long after the collapse of the buffalo-centered world. Another photograph, dated around 1900, depicts a young Pueblo woman on her wedding day. She appears adorned in woven garments, turquoise necklaces, and shell ornaments. Her hairstyle and the textiles presented to her signify passage into adulthood and the continuity of clan life. Weddings within Pueblo communities were not simply unions of individuals but alliances of families, strengthening communal ties. The photograph underscores how, even in the face of territorial loss and outside interference, Pueblo rituals remained intact. Marriage ceremonies affirmed not only personal transitions but also the resilience of the entire community. The period also produced more formalized portraits, influenced by broader American society. In 1886, for example, Julie Nelson was photographed dressed according to late 19th century codes of respectability. Her attire, posture, and hair arrangement reflect urban fashion, suggesting the ways some native women adapted to or were compelled into new social expectations. While such images might appear assimilated, they also reveal strategic navigation. By adopting external styles, women could assert agency in contexts where cultural survival demanded flexibility. Yet amid these changes, the role of women in transmitting tradition remained constant. Accounts from the 1880s note how Comanche women led collective life, preparing food, working hides, setting up camps, and managing exchanges. They sustained economic networks, carried languages and songs, and transmitted rituals to the next generation. Far from passive participants, they were active agents shaping the continuities of their people. Their actions were the invisible infrastructure of survival, ensuring that even in an age of forced removals, their communities endured. Taken together, the portraits of Alice from the Columbia Plateau, the young Comanche woman of 1885, the Pueblo bride around 1900, and others like Julie Nelson form a closing gallery of the Old West. They illustrate that native women did not vanish into myth, nor were they merely subjects for photographers or performers for traveling shows. They remained the central figures of endurance, adaptation, and cultural continuity. Their faces remind us that history is not only about battles and treaties, but also about the quiet persistence of tradition. As the Old West gave way to a new century, native women carried forward languages, rituals, and kinship systems, ensuring that indigenous identities would not only survive, but continue to shape the story of America itself.